May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Cuke Audio Podcast. I'm your host, DC, coming to you from Sleepy Sanur with Dogette Bandita and Feline Cuchita, but without dear lovely Katrinka, who should be here in 6 days, fingers crossed. Don't be another canceled flight. Boy, she's got to jump through hoops to get back here, I'll tell you. And she's got a residence visa. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable and free from financial troubles and able to get out and do whatever you want within the limitations of the universal precept to do as little harm as possible. Today we have Chapter 12 of Crooked Cucumber, the Life and Zen Teaching of Shunryu Suzuki, Sangha, followed by comments at 1 hour, 18 minutes, 26 seconds. Thursday's guest for Life in Bali will be Virginia Helzinka. Along with Donnie Marmer, Virginia co-founded the Unspoken Bali Poetry Slam, which is a pretty cool thing. On Saturday, we'll have Peter and Jane Schneider, old Shunryu Suzuki students who have the Northridge Zendo in L.A. And then Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, we publish mini podcasts, little podcasts with readings from Zen is Right Here, with vignettes about Shunryu Suzuki. Right now, it's readings from Zen is Right Here. So we're going to go right into the chapter now after a pause to meditate. So when you hear the bell, hit pause. Meditate or don't meditate, whatever you wish, as long as you wish, and when you're through, hit unpause, and a bell will ring to end the meditation, which we will have all done together. Crooked Cucumber, the Life and Zen Teaching of Shunryu Suzuki, Chapter 12, Sangha, 1961 and 1962. If you want to study, it is necessary to have a strong, constant, way-seeking mind. Bill McNeil had helped the original group coalesce, had energized them, set an example, then left for the promised land. But now he was lost, having run into a wall in his attempt to find the true way in the land of Zen. Bob Hintz, too, had had a horrible experience with Japanese Zen. After being thrown out of Sekyunin with McNeil, he found he didn't get along with Ruth Fuller Sasaki in Kyoto either. She was too domineering for him. They had gone to Japan, seeking the true way. They had in mind the Satori stories from Paul Rep's Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, and the ideal settings presented by D.T. Suzuki. What they had encountered was more like an obstacle course, an impenetrable language barrier, endless reprimands that they couldn't understand. No way to read the ritual chants, hours of painful sitting on the shins, almost no emphasis on zazen, nothing at all that was relevant or nourishing. The host temple was utterly unprepared to adapt to foreigners, and these foreigners weren't willing to make the considerable effort necessary to continue under those circumstances. It was March of 1961, and McNeil and Hintz were back in San Francisco. McNeil was making an art film. He didn't come around to sit anymore, didn't want to be a monk or study Zen. He said he had discovered his true identity as an artist and homosexual. "I don't want to be any part of Japanese Zen," he would say. He would still drop by Sokoji occasionally to say hello to Suzuki, and now and then they would bump into each other in Japantown. Sometimes Suzuki would bring a student along and visit McNeil and his Japanese lover at their apartment. Hintz resumed sitting at Sokoji. He realized it was the only place in the world where he wanted to study Zen, and Suzuki was the only Zen priest he wanted to study with. But he was sad, like an injured soldier home from war. He never wore his robes. Most people didn't even know that he and McNeil had been ordained. There were a dozen or so regulars at Sokoji, and they sat in order of seniority. Hintz was now in the front seat on the men's side with Bill Kwong and Philip Wilson. Della, Betty, and Jean were still the three loyal ladies in the first seats on their side. Then, in the spring of 1961, two newcomers came to Sokoji who would alter the character of Suzuki's group and the course of his life. The first of these was an Englishman in his mid-20s named Graham Petchy. Alan Watts was giving one of his freewheeling talks at the Berkeley Buddhist Church on a Tuesday evening in May, piecing together Zen, Taoism, psychoanalysis, and Christian mysticism into a fascinating mosaic. Attending the lecture were Watts and Suzuki's colleagues, Wako Kato, a man named Iru Price, and a formally dressed young couple, Graham and Pauline Petchy. Over refreshments, Price presented his card, listing numerous positions and ordinations with Buddhist groups in Malaysia, Thailand, Japan, and America. The Petchys had recently arrived from Europe. Graham had already secured a job as a chemist and was looking forward to finding a Zen master and a Sangha, a community of practicing Buddhists in the Bay Area. Price told him he had to meet Suzuki Sensei at once. Kato pulled out a business card and wrote Suzuki's name and address on the back. Graham had grown up in England. His father had been in the Palace Guards, the elite corps that protects the royal family, surrounding them with solemn ceremony. From an early age, Graham had wanted to know what life was all about, a query that gave impetus to his religious quest. Graham called it his nagging question. He first sought an answer from the Church of England. When that didn't satisfy him, he entered a Roman Catholic Carmelite monastery as a layman. There he found monks working on their own nagging questions with an admirable humility, but he left because he couldn't share their beliefs. He went to Rome to get closer to the source, but found only superficiality and hypocrisy. In Rome, he met Pauline, a young French artist who told exciting stories of her family helping downed flyers during the war. Pauline's mother was a U.S. citizen and a theosophist. In her Paris library, Graham discovered Hinduism, Buddhism, and Zazen, the meditation of Zen monks. Pauline had met D.T. Suzuki and Krishnamurti as a teenager. Before long, Graham and Pauline were married and on their way to San Francisco, carrying a large Buddha statue her mother had given them. Graham's focus from the first had been on trying to figure out what monks did rather than what they were thinking. He tried to do zazen in a chair for a month on the freighter that brought them through the Panama Canal to Northern California in early May of 1961. Only a week after arriving, he was on his way to meet the man he hoped would be a master of zazen. Graham called to make an appointment, and Suzuki suggested he come to zazen at 6 p.m. Graham came at the appointed time, went upstairs, and was chagrined to see on a poster schedule that evening zazen began at 5:30. He abhorred arriving late for his first visit to the temple. His upbringing cried out against it, but the master himself had given him the wrong time, an awkward situation. The door to the office was open, so he went in to wait. Sitting by himself in a chair between the street-side din and the office silence, he listened intently to the sounds emanating from the adjacent room. Heavy breathing. After a while, soft footsteps, and then wham, wham. How surprising. Someone must have dropped something. Then he heard it again. What was going on? Next came bells, chanting and thumping. He straightened his tie and pulled at his pressed white cuffs. Finally, the door to the zendo opened, and Shunryu Suzuki entered. Graham stood up, but Suzuki paid him no mind. He stood by the door and bowed to each of his students as they exited. Graham was shocked at their appearance. Rather than the uniform cotton robes of the Carmelites or the suits, starched collars, and dresses of the London Buddhists, the outfits of the 10 or so meditators who slowly filed out, stopping briefly to bow with Suzuki, were blue jeans and sweatshirts. But Suzuki looked right in his beautiful brown robes. He had a wise face that radiated kindness as well as strictness. After everyone else had gone, Suzuki sat down with Graham, served him tea, and talked to him for half an hour. Suzuki asked if he knew how to sit zazen. Graham said he had tried it in a chair, to which Suzuki responded that it would be better on the tatami. Could he do it? Graham said he didn't know, but he'd try. That first day, he made it through 30 minutes sitting cross-legged, upright, and still as a palace guard. He had never sat that long at one time before. Christmas Humphreys of the London Buddhists had warned that it was dangerous to do more than 10 minutes of meditation without adequate training or experienced guidance. You take the sitting position very well, Suzuki told him. You have no problem. That pleased Graham. Then Suzuki asked, Can you come back at 5:45 tomorrow morning? I'm a married man, Graham responded with shock. Married and employed. He couldn't imagine getting up to go to a temple that early with a day's work ahead. While he pondered, Suzuki offered him more tea. Somehow, Graham picked up on the Japanese custom of offering more tea when it's time to leave. He begged off and said goodbye. Despite his initial reaction, Graham decided to come back the next morning. The zazen, as Suzuki had explained it, made total sense to him. All he had to do was face the wall and follow his breath. No faith, nothing to hold on to, just the nagging question to solve for himself under the guidance of this marvelous, dignified little man. He went home that first evening filled with an overwhelming joy and told Pauline of his good fortune. He dedicated his whole life to zazen on the spot. Graham went every morning, every evening, every Sunday, to every lecture. He never stopped, and he asked no questions. To Suzuki, he was like a good Japanese student. He liked the way Graham would brush his feet off in the aisle before he swung around on his zafu to sit facing the wall. Buddha was great because people were great. When people are not ready, there will be no Buddha. I don't expect every one of you to be a great teacher, but we must have eyes to see that which is good and that which is not so good. This kind of mind will be acquired by practice. The second propitious arrival of 1961 was a dynamic 25-year-old East Coast transplant named Richard Baker. His studies of Western and Eastern philosophy, art, and poetry at Harvard, in Greenwich Village, and in North Beach had brought him into contact with extraordinary minds. But he had yet to meet an exemplar he could respect and trust. That all changed the evening he went with a friend to Field's Metaphysical Bookstore on Polk Street in San Francisco. Richard and his friend had just come from a Japanese restaurant and were on their way to see a samurai movie. Clowning around in the store, Richard swung an air sword and emitted a loud sound, imitating a samurai. George Fields laughed and told him he should go to Sokoji for the lecture by Shunryu Suzuki. You should meet Suzuki Sensei, Fields said. He is a Zen master of the other kind of Zen. He's a wonderful person. By the other kind of Zen, Fields meant Soto, as opposed to Rinzai, which until then had been the focus of almost all the writings in English. Sitting in a metal folding chair in Sokoji's Zendo, Richard was transfixed by Suzuki. It was as if one of the great Chinese masters from the books he'd read had come alive. It wasn't so much what Suzuki said as the unity of his speech and being. Here was a man of deep thought in the classical sense who knew that thought had its limits and strove for a goal beyond thought. Later, Richard attended a seminar held by Alan Watts and Charlotte Selver, a German woman who taught sensory awareness. Richard already knew Watts and was especially delighted to meet Selver. When Selver left town, he sought out Suzuki again. Though Richard had been to a couple of Suzuki's lectures, he realized for the first time that there was some sort of community around Suzuki. He was definitely interested in this master, but thought he himself wasn't up to the meditation. Later, as he thumbed through a book by D.T. Suzuki, who almost never mentioned Zazen, a sentence reached out and grabbed Richard. To think you are not good enough to practice Zazen is a form of vanity. He decided to start going to Zazen immediately. In order to stop the wandering of my mind, he later said. Richard Baker's mother wrote poetry, and his father was a professor who had taught at Harvard and later at the University of Pittsburgh while Richard went to high school. They were not wealthy, but spent each summer at his maternal grandmother's home in Maine, Richard's birthplace, where he felt his roots were. He was always a loner and a reader. At Harvard, he was called the outsider and El Darko. During his fourth year at college, he attended lectures by the theologian Paul Tillich, the Orientalist John K. Fairbank, and the former ambassador to Japan, Edwin O. Reischauer. Despite the impressive qualifications of his teachers, Richard felt dissatisfied with what he was learning. He dropped out shortly before graduation to live in New York City until he was 24. Then he went west on a bus to San Francisco in the fall of 1960 with $35 in his pocket. On the first day, he found poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti's City Lights bookstore and was soon immersed in the literary and artistic circles of North Beach. He moved into an apartment rented by Don Allen, an editor of the Beats he'd come to know back east while working at Grove Press. He got a job with a book distributor and kept looking for something. He fantasized about meeting a Zen master in neighboring Chinatown. Instead, 9 months later, he met a Japanese one. As soon as Richard started to sit regularly, he recognized in Graham Petchy someone who exemplified the excellence a student could demand of himself. Graham thought they could, in their own way, be like Suzuki, could know what he knew, and could become Zen masters. The way Graham applied himself 100% was just what Richard believed in. The two became close friends right away. Richard and Graham were both tall, thin, well-educated, and serious. But there were differences. Graham had a much easier time with the physical demands of Zazen. He could sit up straight in full lotus for the whole 40-minute Zazen period without moving. It was actually even longer than that because one had to be sitting before the period started. Zazen was painful and uncomfortable for Richard. For a long time, He couldn't sit even in half lotus. He called his posture half lily. Perched on several cushions with more cushions under his knees, he had to move at times, but he set goals for himself, such as not moving until Suzuki had finished going around with the stick halfway through the period. Graham brought his life to Zazen, single-mindedly focusing on practice in the Zendo. Richard had brought Zazen to his life, making the world his monastery. He watched his breath while driving, concentrated on his feet while walking, and read Buddhist books voraciously. Suzuki said that Graham concentrated on the posture and Richard on the idea of Zen. Not long after he came to Zen Center, Richard met Virginia Brackett, a student at the Art Institute. In May 1962, Suzuki married them. The Bakers and the Petchis were close, and their lives had many parallels. The Petchis tending to be a step ahead. They both drove Volkswagens, went to samurai movies, had tatami in their apartments, and soon were having babies. One day, Graham and Richard were in the back seat of a car with Suzuki riding in front. Richard leaned forward and asked, "Suzuki-sensei, do you think we can understand Buddhism?" "Yes, if you practice. If you know how to practice," Suzuki replied, turning around and looking Richard in the eyes. At that moment, Richard knew he would practice Zen his whole life. If you want to practice Zazen, it is necessary to have good friends. Then naturally, you will have good practice. Suzuki's daughter Yasuko and her younger brother Hoitsu watched the Montana Maru slowly pull out of Yokohama Harbor. On board were Mitsu and Otohiro, off to America. Otohiro cried hard and waved goodbye from the deck. George Hagiwara, Suzuki's good friend in the Sokoji congregation, had set the move in motion late in 1960. Hagiwara was visiting relatives in Japan, and at Suzuki's urging, he made a special trip to Yaizu to implore Mitsu to go to America. He told her that Suzuki wanted to stay longer than originally planned. So many people were coming to study with him that he felt he couldn't accomplish his mission in just 3 years. He needed her help. Kinu Oba-san also urged Mitsu to go, saying that Shunryu had been living abroad for 2 years alone, managing everything by himself. It was important work, and she wanted him to succeed. Mitsu succumbed to the pressure, swallowed her pride, and agreed to go. Oba-san insisted that Suzuki's youngest son go too. Otohiro was 17, almost through high school, and she couldn't be responsible for him anymore. Knowing that he might not be back for a long time, Otohiro visited his sister Omi at the mental institution to say goodbye. She had been there for 6 years. It would probably be her permanent home. He had come only a few times through the years, and she was happy to see him. She had gained a lot of weight. Once Mitsu had agreed to go, Suzuki wrote to her, "I've bought you a bed with the very best mattress. Also, I got you an American ironing board and fancy new iron. They stand up here to do their ironing. These are the only things I have bought you. It's not much, I know, but I am eagerly awaiting your arrival with Otohiro, whom I also miss very much." On June 14, 1961, Mitsu and Otohiro were met by Suzuki and a small entourage from the congregation at Pier 41 in San Francisco. Like Suzuki when he'd first arrived, Mitsu and Otohiro were shocked at the austerity of their living quarters. The rooms were clean, but there was only space enough to sleep. Otohiro slept in the attic chamber across the landing from his parents' room. Suzuki had squeezed Mitsu's new bed next to his own. Later, she confided to a student that he did not invite her to his bed for 6 months. She felt that this was because he had been so affected by the attentions of other women. It wasn't just the urgings of Obasan and Hagiwara that had changed Mitsu's mind. In his recent letters, Suzuki had told her how kindly some of the women students were treating him. He hinted that advances had been made, though not from his close women students. It would be easier to resist them if she were there, he wrote. One woman had hidden in the building and approached him after he'd locked up. She wouldn't leave, and he finally had to call a senior student to come help him. There was a very helpful woman named Alice, who sometimes cooked for Suzuki and urged him to try a health food diet that included carrot juice. She noticed that his teeth were bad, took up a collection, and took him to a dentist to get a set of false teeth. She did his laundry and bought him some long johns. He'd never seen long underwear. He liked them and would continue to wear them to bed and even under his robes when it was cold. She didn't go to Zazen much, but became a fixture in the kitchen, drinking tea with Suzuki and his students and saying, "Please, Sensei, tell me about Zen. I'm really trying hard to understand." As soon as Mitsu arrived, Alice disappeared and went to India to look for another guru. The congregation and the students welcomed the new Suzukis. They brought gifts and showed them around town. A Sokoji couple, the Katsuyamas, invited them to dinner on a Tuesday night, and it soon became an established custom. Suzuki took his wife and son to Mimatsu, a cheap old-fashioned Japanese restaurant with high wooden booths where he frequently went. 3 members of the Sokoji congregation owned it. He showed them Honami's fine handicraft store and a Japanese confectionery where they ate green manju sweets and drank tea. George Hagiwara took them all to the Japanese tea garden. It was almost as if Mitsu and Otohiro had gone to another Japanese city. Otohiro was painfully shy and felt lost. He dreaded finishing high school in America and begged not to be made to go. Maybe he could get a job, he said. He had never done well in school in Japan, and he didn't know any English. His father said he would learn. The worst part was that he had to be a junior again. Suzuki organized a group for older teenage boys, both Japanese and Japanese American, Not just temple members, about 25 of them met once a week. Otohiro made some friends. After a few months, he moved into a small apartment across the street that Sokoji maintained for guests. If you live together, there is not much need to speak to each other. You will understand. Mitsu and Shunryu had never lived together before, but they quickly adapted to life together. Her responsibility, as she saw it, was to take care of her husband first, then the members, the Zazen students, and the building. She was as industrious as he was. On her first morning after breakfast, she made pickles while her husband melted down old candles into new ones. She cooked, cleaned, did laundry, received visitors, and met with the women's group. Beyond the call of duty, she sat zazen with her husband's students, taking the front seat next to the kitchen door on the women's side. She enlivened Sokoji. There was a lot more talk with her around, and she was no pushover for Suzuki. They were old friends, and he was used to relating to her on a fairly equal basis, considering the traditional culture they came from. Sometimes students would hear them get into a squabble, a new side to their master. Mitsu took to her new life at Sokoji with admirable ease. She said it was just like her job in Japan, where there had always been people visiting and hanging out at the school, except now there were Caucasians as well as Japanese. She started to pick up English right away, just enough. With her outgoing personality, it was probably easier for her to move into the role of temple wife in San Francisco than it would have been in Japan. Everybody took to calling Mitsu Okusan, which means Mrs., a traditional address for the wife of the house. A lot of people thought it was her name. Okusan was friendly with the Zazen students and especially got along with Betty, Della, and Jean, but she objected to the fact that many of the younger ones were often unkempt and had dirty feet. "Don't complain," Suzuki told her. "They are good Zen students and you should respect them. In fact, you should wash their feet." Okusan took him seriously and started to put out carefully folded damp towels at the doorway to the zendo. She would show the students how to wipe their feet before they stepped into the room. Clean feet, she would say in her sweet musical voice. The students accepted her right away, and feet were cleaner. More and more, we created a feeling of Sangha. At a Saturday afternoon meeting in the spring of 1961, Shunryu Suzuki suggested that his Zazen students form a non-profit corporation so the contributions some of them were making could be deducted from their income tax. Suzuki was meticulous about not using Sokoji's funds for personal use, and he was likewise careful not to confuse the finances of the two congregations. He insisted, for instance, that the Zazen students pay rent to the Japanese congregation for their use of the zendo. He felt uncomfortable taking money personally and wanted there to be a treasurer to handle it. After 2 years of practicing together, it was time to have an organization. Bishop Reiden Yamada, the new abbot of Zen Shuji in L.A., and now the titular head of Soto Zen in America, agreed that the group should incorporate and suggested a Japanese name. Hintz said that a Japanese name would not sit well with English-speaking students and suggested the name Zen Center. Everyone liked it. They tossed the name around. A center for Zen. Zen in the center. Center yourself on Zen. In August 1961, Bob Hintz was elected the first president, and he started to work on getting Zen Center incorporated. One Saturday, he came to Sokoji for a meeting, leaving all the paperwork in his briefcase on a table in the downstairs office. A boy passing by walked in the open door, grabbed the briefcase, and ran off toward Fillmore Street. Hintz couldn't catch him. There were no copies of the papers. All the while, Hintz was going through intense difficulties, questioning whether he should continue practicing at Sokoji. He poured his heart out one day to Philip Wilson at Philip's apartment. He said that Suzuki wanted him to be a priest, but he couldn't give up his architecture practice and his lay life. He said that East couldn't meet the West, that Jung was as close as they could get. I can't do it anymore, he said. A few days later, Hintz had a mental breakdown and had to be hospitalized. It was a crisis for the group as well as for him. A meeting was held, and Graham Pecci was elected president, even though he'd been there only 2 months. Gene Ross, the most outspoken of the old-timers and obvious choice to succeed Hintz, was planning to leave at some point for Japan to study Zen. She nominated Graham. He proved to be as efficient and thorough as expected. 6 weeks later, he submitted incorporation papers to the California Secretary of State. Some people felt uncomfortable with the new institutional status. Philip said they should just sit and not worry about the details. If they lost Sokoji, they could sit in a garage. Suzuki wanted to have an established group that did business in a conventional manner. The religion was unconventional enough. He saw practical benefits in a clearly defined organization, and he didn't share his young students' anti-establishment attitudes. Healthy institutions were part of a strong society, he believed, and there was no need to fear that the group would lose its character. He said there would be problems no matter what they did, and that if they concentrated on Zazen, on confidence in their Buddha nature, they would be all right. Not that Suzuki himself was a good fiscal manager. Soon after Mitsu arrived, the treasurer of the congregation told her that her husband hadn't been cashing his paychecks. First, the treasurer had to explain what checks were. There was no such thing in Japan, or if there was, she'd never heard of it. She caught on quickly. After some searching, Oak-san found the checks when they fell out of a book in the office. From then on, they went to her. What had he been living on, she wondered. Another example of her husband's impracticality led Oksan to insist that she do the grocery shopping. He would sometimes drop by the market on his way home to purchase vegetables, especially his favorite, sweet potatoes. The problem was that he would choose the oldest, most wilted and damaged vegetables. She would ask him how in the world he could pay money for such produce. He'd say he felt sorry for them. She had even found him on the street picking up Chinese cabbage that had fallen off the delivery truck. Echoes of his father. With Oksan there, time with Suzuki became more precious. He wasn't as available as before to go out to movies and dinner, although the pleasant morning tea time continued after service, and people still dropped by to say hello or ask questions. Even though Oksan was friendly and enjoyed being with the students, she was always encouraging her husband to go back to Japan. She thought he was too weak and prone to illness to stay. Suzuki would make his students nervous when he'd mention the possibility of going back. His 3-year term would be up the following spring. People felt it was wonderful being with him, but there was a tinge of fear because they didn't know when it would end. There was a shared enthusiasm to enjoy it while it lasted, make the most of it, learn what could be learned. Amidst the insecurity, there was a sense of certainty that what they were doing together was deeply meaningful and beneficial. Every once in a while, Shunryu Suzuki would do something extreme to dislodge his students from the ruts they were in, to knock them off their self-satisfied perches, out of their dreamy lives, and back into the arena of insecurity, where they could rededicate themselves to what he called beginner's practice. One morning, in the midst of the collective and individual harmony that had accrued from their efforts in zazen and practice, when the confidence level was at its zenith, Suzuki made his morning greeting, walking in gasho around the room behind his students seated on their zafus. He bowed at the altar and assumed his position on the platform facing the room, just as he did every day. In the middle of the period, he got up, straightened a few postures, and hit Sleepy Bill Kwong on his shoulders twice each, just as he did every day. He went back to his seat and resumed sitting. Then, all of a sudden, from Suzuki's small frame roared out the guttural sound of an angry lion. "You think you're sitting zazen? You're not sitting zazen. You're wasting your time." He hopped off his cushion and flew down the aisles, whacking each person 4 times, twice on each shoulder, quick as lightning, his robes flying back, creating a tornado in the zendo. Then he was back in his seat in silence. The room of stunned sitters electrified. As each bowed to Suzuki at the door on their way out after service, they were a little less sure of themselves. He looked at them squarely, but without a hint of anger, as if everything were normal. Complacency and pride lay shattered on the floor. Using the stick like this is a traditional practice of Japanese Zen called rinsaku. Suzuki would do it from time to time, often without saying a word. I think our teaching is very good, very, very good. But if we become too arrogant and believe in ourselves too much, we will be lost. There will be no teaching at all, no Buddhism at all. So when we find the joy of our life in our composure, and when we don't know what it is, when we don't understand anything, then our mind is very great, very wide. Then our mind is open to everything. To come to this point, we should be relieved of the arrogance of too much belief in ourselves and of the kind of selfish, immature, childish mind that is always expecting something. Our mind should be big enough to know before we know something. We should be grateful before we have something. Without anything, we should be very happy. Before we attain enlightenment, we should be happy to practice our way, or else we cannot attain anything in its true sense. First thought, best thought. Hintz was never the same after his nervous breakdown. One day he dropped by Sokoji and bid his teacher of 2.5 years farewell. He was moving to Chicago to work for an architecture firm. Suzuki shared Hintz's sense of failure, but knowing there was nothing he could say to keep him, he let Hintz go as gracefully as he'd welcomed him the first day. Hintz had suggested developing a mailing list. Some students wanted to have a way to get the word out that Suzuki was teaching Zen at Sokoji. Thus, the idea of a newsletter was born. Philip Wilson and his petite scholar wife, JJ, drafted the first one, but wondered what to call it. Zen Center Newsletter? Various names were suggested. "I'll name it," said Suzuki, and he went upstairs. 20 minutes later, he came down with a piece of paper. The words "Wind Bell" were written on it, with a brush in black sumi ink, beside a drawing of the same. Below the drawing was his translation of Dogen's poem, Wind Bell. Hanging in space by his mouth. His whole body is his mouth. East, west, south, and north wind, he does not care. Always, he talks in many ways about Prajnaparamita for others. Tsuchinchunryan, Tsuchinryan. Dogen. Philip and JJ tried to run off the newsletter on the mimeograph machine, but the results were too faint. Suzuki joined them in his work pants and undershirt. He used the ink much more liberally. He was excited. These would be his group's first printed words. He made a mess, spilling the ink on himself and the floor. Soon his arms and torso were covered in purple, and he proudly held the first dripping copy. "I guess I was being too cautious," said JJ as they cleaned everything up. The next day was Saturday, December 2nd, 1961. People stood around reading the newly printed and smudged windbells or tucking them into their pockets. Some took a bunch to post on bulletin boards of colleges and coffee houses. "What the devil do we need a newspaper for?" Graham wanted to know. Richard shrugged. "Those people interested in Zen Buddhism may be glad to know that there is a Zen center in San Francisco which, for nearly 2.5 years, has been under the guidance of Roshi Shunryu Suzuki," read Graham. Richard at times used the honorific title Roshi for Suzuki. He'd read it, heard Suzuki use it when referring to priests he revered, and according to some people who'd studied Zen in Japan, it was the proper way to address Zen masters there. The second windbell, in January 1962, reported on a visit by Philip Kapleau to Sokoji. He had given a talk on an old Japanese master named Basui. Afterwards, he met with students and talked about his 9 years of study in Japan with Sogaku Harada Roshi and Harada's heir Hakuun Yasutani Roshi. Renegade Soto teachers who were using koans like Rinzai teachers. Kapleau's wife joined him in answering questions. In Japan, they had sat many sesshins, practicing arduous zazen all night long in the cold and the heat, concentrating on koans and pushing themselves with fervor toward attaining kensho, an enlightenment experience. Harada had died, but Yasutani was still going strong. Suzuki sat listening among his spellbound students. It sounded so different from studying with him. Some wanted to go right away to Japan. Maybe they could get enlightened working with Yasutani. Suzuki's way seemed so slow. At the following Saturday lecture, Suzuki emphasized the difference in the two traditional Zen approaches. Our way is to practice one step at a time, one breath at a time, with no gaining idea. For the next year, there would be a windbell every month, each one a little longer than the last. Thus, the record of Suzuki's talks began. He was getting more comfortable with his English and had people who were qualified to make his teaching available in print. Richard and some other students were always writing down my lectures and asking me many questions about them. What I said with my broken English was very different from what I had in mind, so I had to write down something. In the windbell, they didn't get the original talk, but my broken English corrected by someone else like Richard. Richard Baker would go through his notes from Suzuki's lectures, come up with crystallizations of the teaching, go over the text with Suzuki, and submit it to Graham for publication in Windbell. If you think I practice Zazen, that is a misunderstanding. Buddha practices Zazen, not you. If you think I practice Zazen, there will be many troubles. If you think Buddha practices Zazen, there will not be trouble. Whether or not your zazen is painful or full of erroneous ideas, it is still Buddha's activity. There is no way to escape from Buddha's activity. Thus, you must accept yourself and devote yourself to yourself, or to Buddha, or to Zazen. When you become yourself, Zazen becomes Zazen, and Zen becomes Zen. Like the birds I came, no road under my feet. A golden chained gate unlocks itself. Shunryu Suzuki was all decked out in red robes with a yellow brocade okesa and pointy hat. In his hand he carried a white ox hair whisk. He recited his poem at the door of Sokoji and ceremoniously entered Sokoji as if for the first time. It was May 20th, 1962, 3 days before his third year was up. He wasn't going back to Japan as planned. He was being installed as the abbot of Sokoji in a mountain seat ceremony. Shinsan Shiki. In the downstairs auditorium, several hundred older Japanese Americans in suits and ties and Sunday best, not just temple members, but guests from the whole Japanese American community, sat waiting for him to enter. Scattered among them, tending to take seats in the back, were 60 or so mainly younger Americans in various styles of dress. Amidst the ring of high and low bells and the boom of a drum struck by Richard Baker in the balcony, Suzuki proceeded upstairs to the zendo and kitchen altars to offer incense and recite poems. Soon the chime of bells approached, and a procession of guest priests, congregation officers, and children from both groups with flowers in their hands entered the auditorium. Following them, Suzuki glided up the aisle as smoothly as a bride and stepped up to an ornate altar put together for the occasion. He offered a stick of incense and recited another poem. Next to him stood Bishop Yamada from L.A., who was officiating. After I lift this one piece of incense, it is still there. Although it is still there, it is hard to lift. Now I offer it to Buddha and burn it with no hand, repaying the benevolence of this temple's founder, successive ancestors, and my master, Gyokujun Soon Daiyosho. Suzuki then ascended to the mountain seat, sitting in a lacquered chair on a platform beside the altar. Finally, he was the abbot of Sokoji and had officially received the temple seal. It was his third such installation after Zōnin and Rinzōin. He had made another 3-year commitment. People weren't happy about this back in Yaizu. They didn't understand why he hadn't returned. If they had seen his ragtag Western students at the reception. They might have wondered why he'd waste his time on them, but these students would be there for Zazen the next morning and the morning after that. You are like loaves of bread cooking in the oven. Suzuki still had no particular plan, but he had high hopes for planting Dharma seeds in America and for developing a mutually beneficial exchange with Japan. In March 1962, there had been a farewell party for Jean Ross before she left for Japan. Jean was his second student to go to Eiheiji, the first being Nona Ransom. Jean had had her mind set on going to what she called the source for quite some time. He knew she would be challenging for Eiheiji, so set in its ways. The experience with McNeil and Hintz had made Suzuki more cautious, but he had confidence that Jean would do better than they had. She wasn't naively idealistic. She had a pragmatic doggedness, and Suzuki was convinced that her conservative, sincere style would put her hosts more at ease. She was still coming to Sokoji only 3 days a week, but she had persevered through a number of weekend sessions and passed the initiation of the week-long session in August 1961. That type of tenacity can't be faked. In May, Windbell printed Jean's first letter from Eiheiji. She was working and practicing with the monks. She had her own room and was getting up at 3 a.m. to be out of the washroom before they came in at 3:30. She was not complaining about the hours of chanting every day and climbing 95 steps daily to Dogen's Memorial Hall. She was withstanding the culture shock and making friends despite the language barrier. These priests from the country are men, not saints. Their faces express a high degree of individualism tempered by much discipline, she wrote, and later more poignantly, as for me, I stood on the Eiheiji earth, and for the first time I felt planted in earth. I began to recognize Buddha nature not only in man but in all forms of life. Such expansion eased the pressure of adjustment. The practice of Zazen is not for gaining a mystical something. Zazen is for allowing a clear mind, as clear as a bright autumn sky. In August 1962, Suzuki and his students had their third annual week-long session. This one started earlier in the day, ended later, and was the first one to go morning to night for a full 7 days. Suzuki had invited Bishop Yamada to lead it, and he came up from L.A. for the last 5 days. Yamada gave lectures on the great Indian sage Nagarjuna and the semi-legendary Bodhidharma, and conducted Doksan private interviews. Suzuki rang the bells, made sure everything went smoothly, and sat every period, encouraging his students with his steadfastness. The students endured pain in their legs and backs, boredom and restlessness. 30 people sat at least some of the session, and over half as many stayed for the whole thing. Pauline Pecci had never had anything important to talk to Suzuki about in Dokusan. She would ask him theoretical questions like, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does it make a sound? It doesn't matter, he'd answered. Pauline set the sesshin. Her legs were killing her. It was tough being the wife of the guy who was setting the standard. Graham never moved, even in the extra long periods that Suzuki would throw in unexpectedly. Pauline, on the other hand, was just trying to get through the day without screaming. She sat in the middle of the room and so had an aisle in front of her rather than the wall. During a moment of particular difficulty, she saw Suzuki step in front of her. Something about his feet struck her. She watched them intently as he walked slowly by. Then a calm came over her, and the pain separated from her. It didn't matter anymore. Her chattering mind dropped away. Standing for Keening, she looked around the room as if seeing her fellow students for the first time and realized how trapped they all were in petty social games. She felt love for everyone in the room. She looked at Suzuki and saw him connected with them in this trouble-free space, not in the realm of their delusion. Soon afterward, she saw him in Dokusan. After bowing 3 times to the floor, she sat on the cushion facing him. After a moment of following breaths together, she told him about her experience, which she was sure signaled permanent enlightenment. Very nice, he said. You've reached deep zazen. On the last day of the sesshin, at a lay ordinations, students who had practiced with Suzuki for over 1 year received precepts and a Buddhist name. Yamada had brought 15 Ratsus, which turned out to be the perfect number. One by one, in order of their arrival at Sokoji, people came forward to receive their cloth Ratsus and lineage papers, the names of the ancestors dating back to Buddha written on rice paper, folded and placed in a rice paper envelope with calligraphy by Suzuki on the front. Betty and Della were the first in line. Jean was in Japan. Graham and Richard were last, having arrived just over a year before. It was a happy day for Suzuki, another small step in his effort to establish Buddhism as he knew it in the West. The ceremony was conducted in Japanese, which the students didn't understand, but Suzuki told them they were making the vow to keep the enlightened life. He explained the meaning of their new Buddhist names. Della would still be called Della, but she was also now Zendote Jundaishi, a rather long name composed of characters that he said meant Zenwei, faith, refined naturalness. Before the ordination, Della told Suzuki that she had not rejected her Lutheran upbringing. I guess I'm going to be a Christian Buddhist, she said. That's all right, Suzuki answered. Suzuki took the back seat, as he had with Kishizawa at ordinations at his temple in Yaizu. He deferred to the older Yamada because it was proper. He was the bishop. In this way, word would get back to Japan that there were some serious students in America. He appreciated the support he got from Yamada, obligatory but still helpful. It was good for his students to see and hear another priest. I am very grateful we have instruction from various teachers, he said. We need more teachers. While the session was in progress, a letter had arrived from the Secretary of State. Zen Center's nonprofit status was official. They had raised almost $5,000 that year and had been able to save over $500, which would go into a building fund. The ordination and incorporation were important to Suzuki, but he made clear what was essential for his teaching to take hold. Unless you know how to practice Zazen, no one can help you. Heavy rain may wash away the small seed when it has not taken root. You should not be like a sesame with no roots, or your practice will be washed away. But if you have a really good root, the heavy rain will help you a lot. Some people felt like Philip, who asked why they needed any organization or any ordination ceremony. It's just like the Catholic Church, he said. Little did he realize how close he was to the truth. Soto Zen was full of hierarchy and ceremony in Japan, but considering the autonomy of individual temples and priests and the growing role of the membership in making decisions, maybe the Baptist Church would have provided a better analogy. Suzuki had to show them how these things were done in Japan, he said, because that's what he knew. He had to establish Zen Center in a way that he was comfortable with. Being impatient would not work. Someday they would have their own Buddhist forms. Transmitting Buddhism to America isn't so simple. You can have your own way someday, but first learn mine. And don't be in too big a hurry. It's not like passing a football. Comments on Crooked Cucumber, the life and Zen teaching of Shunryu Suzuki. Chapter 12, Sangha. So McNeil and Hintz, it did not work out for them. Suzuki sending them to Sekyunin. That's the mother temple over in Sohim. It had no, there was nobody there involved with foreigners. I mean, the Westerners who were over in Japan, almost entirely, there are some very few exceptions. I'm not sure what they are in Soto. Brian Victoria was over there pretty early, and he went to AHE and got ordained. But mainly they were studying Rinzai. And at that time when McNeil and Hintz were over there, it was happening in Kyoto at Daitokuji with Ruth Fuller Sasaki. And they did end up there, and that was a much friendlier situation, but, she was too domineering for them, and they wanted to be free and started teaching English and, meeting artists and homosexuals in Japan is what they got into. But, meeting poets and other people, Americans and Japanese. But, it didn't work out for them. And McNeil came back and, he'd been the mover and shaker for Suzuki. He'd been the one that really helped bring the group together. He came back, he didn't want to have anything to do with Zen, but he did keep up with Suzuki somewhat. But, he just had another lifestyle, and he was making a film, all that. He was very close with Joanne Kiger. Joanne said she'd get in arguments with him when he came back from Japan. He was excited about having discovered he was a homosexual in Japan, and he was really into it. And I said to him, Bill, being a homosexual can't be your identity. But he was an early advocate of gay pride. And, the way I've heard it from some people is that he was one of the people, he was an energy, a sort of force behind creating the whole phenomena of the Castro district in San Francisco becoming a mecca for homosexuals around the world, for gays around the world. And I thought that was so interesting that he helped coalesce people around Zen Center. And then when he realized he was gay and felt positive about it, he coalesced people around that idea in San Francisco. And it was said he hung out a lot at the Stud and other gay bars. The Stud was a very well-known gay bar in San Francisco. It wasn't a good one for a straight person to go to. There were some of them were really good for straight people too. There were like mixed. Some of them, like Hamburger Mary's was the best, was like a mixed bar, mixed gay and straight and different races, where people could sort of celebrate people being free to be themselves and not having to hide. So that's what McNeil got into in one sense, but he also got into his art. So in a sense, what happened to McNeil was when he went to Japan, it was that he found himself. And Suzuki would tell people, they'd say, what is Zen? And he'd say, just be yourself. And so that's what Bill McNeil did in a way that worked for him. There's a tendency around spiritual groups or any sort of group where there's a shared belief or practice or something, that if somebody leaves it, they've failed. That's very strong in Japan, in the monastic world that I know of anyway. You can be like a really good practitioner in a monastery or something for 20 years, but if you leave, you're a quitter. You were a failure. I've definitely noticed that. But, we don't really know what life is or what we are or anything like. We don't know what the heck is happening. And I'm very grateful to have run into Buddhism and Suzuki and practice, and I'm into it. But, people are on paths that are much bigger and have much bigger than we can see. So we can't say that Bill McNeil failed or that it was, too bad. I'm sure that Suzuki was very disappointed, but I think our paths begin before we're here and continue after we're here in ways that we just can't understand, or that it would be very rare for someone to understand. And he stayed friends with some people around Zen Center. They all said he was a really good artist. And I've got an interview. Darn, I never transcribed it. I've got the notes in a notebook back in storage with a fella that was very close with him. And I can't remember the guy's name, but he lived right next door to the old Sokoji. By the time I interviewed him, it was an empty building. It says the host temple was utterly unprepared to adapt to foreigners, and these foreigners weren't willing to make the considerable effort necessary to continue under those circumstances. Yeah, well, they had some idea about Zen they'd gotten, and, Suzuki wasn't the type to sit them down and say, listen, guys, you've got a totally unrealistic idea about what's going to happen over there. I mean, he was sort of, he would send his people. He didn't send them there. They wanted to go. But he did send people later, as we will learn, and with their agreement for periods of time. And it was like throwing them in the ocean. I mean, it's like they're going to another planet. It's nothing to do with the sort of Zen practice. Well, I wouldn't say it has nothing to do with it, but it's quite different from the Zen practice here. And it's very, very involved with Japanese culture, and especially Eiheiji, with priestcraft, training priests to run temples. Whereas some of the Rinzai places were really focused on zazen and practice and working on koans, and were much more amenable to having foreigners. I mean, when I was in Japan, I lived next door to a Rinzai temple. I had a wonderful time and studied as a very poor student with Shodo Harada Roshi there. And was very close with the other students, and so was Elin, who was there with me. But back in the early 60s, there was one person I know who went to Ryu Takuju, and we'll get into him later, and that's Dan Welsh. And he was there a year and a half, and he did it. And he was like just out of high school. I mean, he was young. And he learned a lot. He learned good Japanese, and he really applied himself. He was raised a Quaker, and that certainly helped. So then we get into the arrival of two people that would change the course of Zen Center and of Suzuki's life. First, it was Graham Pecci, Graham and Pauline. And, his story is so great. He was so sincere, and Graham and I were very, very close. And he just died, 2-3 years ago. And we were very, very, I was talking to him on the phone up to the end. And he and I lived near each other in California. I always kept up with him in later years. And Graham was always very British. He held on to it. He would still pronounce the words they pronounce differently than the way they do. And like it says, his father was in the Coldstream Guard, which is about as traditional as you can get. But look at him. He tried out the Episcopalian monastery of some sort, a retreat, and then he tried the Catholic monastery out, and then he went to Rome and was shocked at the hypocrisy and superficiality. Wow, really? But there he met Pauline, and they just hit it off. And like it says, Pauline's mother was a Theosophist, and that's where he ran into Buddhism with her. And Pauline, my gosh, she had met Krishnamurti and D.T. Suzuki, and Graham stayed close with Pauline's mother until she died. Her ashes are at Tassajara. Suzuki wouldn't give her, it's interesting, he would not ordain her as a layperson because she didn't sit zazen. It says in there, in Rome, he met Pauline, a young French artist who told exciting stories of her family helping downed flyers during the war. That's true, and she's told me about that as a little girl, like a very little girl, I don't know, 6 years old or something. Her father was in the French underground, and they would help flyers get to Spain. Spain was not part of Nazi-controlled or German-controlled territory, and she would take them to the bus station and sit with them and get them on a bus when she was a real tiny little girl. These flyers. That's interesting, huh? That whole image of the way to get them out. It's not sneaking out at night with searchlights and stuff. Just go to the bus station, get them on a bus and send them out there. But she said the Vichy French police, now there was a tremendous amount of collaboration between the French and the occupying Germans. And if you want to see a distressing movie about it, see the 4-hour-long The Sorrow and the Pity. It is really sad movie. It's a movie that Woody Allen in one of his movies takes a day to. I think I saw it at the Surf Theater in San Francisco, which was the #1 art theater playing, movies that weren't mainstream movies there in San Francisco. Went there many times. Surf Theater is out by the ocean in the avenues. You could take a trolley out there and get to it. Pauline told me she remembers Vichy French police coming to her home to look for any evidence that there had been some flyer there. They had to be very careful, not to leave any cigarette butts out or anything that indicated somebody else had been there. And she said they'd take her aside and ask her, hi, sweet little girl, had any guests in your home recently and stuff like that? And she said she had to know how to answer them. And it was a matter of life and death for her family, which is this little girl. Wow. So he and Pauline hit it off, and they bring a Buddha with them to America. They bring a Buddha with them to San Francisco, where they could have bought a Buddha easily. That's so interesting. It's so impractical. And they took a freighter, and it took a month to get there. Think of that. Well, I almost took a freighter to Rio from Houston once. I was meeting some friends there, and I went to a Greek restaurant where ship captains and people on the ships tended to go, and I met one, and he was willing to talk about it. I don't remember why it didn't work out, but that used to be a thing people would do. Richard Baker was in the Merchant Marine when that's how he saw Europe, I think, when, out of college. And we see a little later in the chapter Mitsu and Otohiro coming to America on a ship. And about that time, in the early 60s, using traveling by water across the Atlantic or Pacific as, one of your options for, normal travel. That's about the end of that period. And then it became just something to do as for pleasure or a novelty. All right, so anyway, Graham and Pauline go to this lecture in Berkeley at the Buddhist Churches of America. Now, the Buddhist Churches of America is Jodo Shinshu. And Jodo Shinshu, a number of the people who were interested in Zen would also go to the BCA. And there was a BCA just around the corner from Sokoji, and it had the Buddhist bookstore. It was the only Buddhist bookstore in America, I think. I don't think it's there anymore. And a fellow who ran it and I are still in touch. God, he'd be a good person to interview. That's a good idea. He was very close with Ananda, Claude Dallenberg. Jodo Shinshu is very friendly with Zen, and Zen's friendly with it. It's thought of as other power, more faith-oriented, but a lot of us incorporate a good deal of Jodo Shinshu in our practice. Lou Hartman felt strongly about that. So did Ananda Claude Dallenberg. He was he went to, in fact, he was more Jodo Shinshu as he got older than Zen. And he had a relationship with the BCA near Zen Center. But Jodo Shinshu's thing is arigatai kokoro, grateful mind. And it came out of Jodoshu, which is onagai kokoro. I've already mentioned this in a prior podcast, I think, because I remember writing it down. Onagai kokoro is like supplicating mind. Please save me, Buddha. And then onagai kokoro is thank you that I'm already saved. And started by Shinran. And it's very big in Japan. It and Soto Zen are both very big. And not necessarily the practice for lay people, but a lot of lay people, that's the priests that do their memorial services and stuff. It says when Graham and Pauline were over there that they heard a spirited lecture by Alan Watts. And I just looked to see what I had on that in the interviews, and it said that afterwards, Reverend Eru Price, that Graham met him and was talking, and that told him he was interested in Zen, and Price said, oh, well, you've got to meet Suzuki Sensei over in San Francisco. And then it said Kato was there, Kano Kato, Suzuki's assistant, first couple of years, and wrote down the Sokoji number on maybe his card or something. Having a name card is a Japanese thing. Meishi, they call it. Yeah, I know. Graham said it was Iru that told him, but then Pauline in her interview said, no, it was Kato that gave the card. But, Bryce was there. But another thing I saw in looking at all this, it didn't say anything about Alan Watts giving a lecture. It said Irving Bryce was giving the lecture, and he did give lectures at the BCA. But there has to be a reason why I put that in the book. It could have been that I got a call from Graham going, David, yes, I've been thinking. He was very, very, very helpful. He spent a lot of time with me on it, and he was always calling me with new memories. And there's a tremendous amount about him and Pauline on Cuke.com, way more than in the book. It's, I could just hear him saying, I've been thinking about the initial meeting where we heard about Suzuki Sensei at the BCA in Berkeley, and I think it wasn't Price giving a talk. I think it was Alan Watts, yes. I'm not saying that I remember that happening. I'm saying it could have been something like that. A lot of stuff went into the book that I just remembered, or that just happened like that. But I wouldn't have put that in if there wasn't a reason. So I haven't changed it. But I sort of think maybe it's wrong. I don't know. But it's not the sort of mistake that matters much. And because that is the sort of thing that could have happened, is Alan Watts would have given a talk there, because it was sort of a happening place, the BCA in Berkeley, back then. So, and we'll hear more about Pauline and Graham. Let me take a look real quick, see if there. I have a whole little page on them here. I just made it for comments, but I think there'll be more comments in the coming chapters. Oh yeah, here's a cool thing. That when here, this is from an interview with Graham. He's talking about Irving Bryce. He says, it was he who introduced us to, we said we were very interested in Zen, and he said, well, there's a person over on Bush Street. We found out his name, and Pauline said, I've heard that name before. She went and got one of her diaries, when they got home, and sure enough, about 2 years before that time, she had Sokoji written down as a place you should visit if you came to San Francisco. And Graham said, any memory differences with him and Pauline, defer to her. One more thing from the Graham section. When he is shocked to see people leaving the Zendo and bowing to Suzuki and not wearing proper clothes. and sweatshirts and blue jeans. When I hear blue jeans, I wonder, did they really have blue? Oh, it's so hard to sit in blue jeans. Like, they're sort of stiff, and hope they weren't too tight. I never sat in blue jeans. Or I might have sat at first in blue jeans, but I learned not to. You need, loose pants or a robe. That's a really nice thing to sit in. Or a sarong. And now Richard Baker comes into the scene, and so he's in San Francisco and says he moved into an apartment. Well, I added something there in what I read. I said he moved in with Don Allen, whom he knew from Grove Press in New York City, where he'd worked. And Don Allen was an important part of the whole beat thing. He was although he wasn't a hippie type, he wasn't a beatnik type. He was rather conventional seeming fellow, but he lived near us in Bolinas years later. I used to go visit him, and there's a very interesting interview with him on Cuke.com. Oh my God, yes, he was an interpreter in World War II on on the island the Enola Gay flew out of, I think, that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. Anyway, he had some interesting things to say in his in that interview long ago. But I had a book that he had edited that I got in high school. It was like the New American Poetry, and it had all these beat poets. He didn't include Diane de Prima, which was bad, and that was a mistake. I don't know why he did that. But there were 2 books that came out that year, or right about the same time, that claimed to be like the New American Poetry. I mean, that was the name of his book. But his book had like Gregory Corso and Allen Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti and all that, right? The other book was, I subscribed to the Saturday Review of Literature when I was in high school, and it sort of represented the other school. Yeah, the Saturday Review of Literature, it changed later, years later, to the Saturday Review. It was founded by Norman Cousins, a leading American intellectual who I got to meet years later in involvement with the nuclear freeze movement. And I worked with his daughter in SDS briefly, Candace Cousins. And I can remember her being at Green Gulch. Not as a student, but she'd come there sometimes. Anyway, Don Allen edited that book, The New American Poetry. But like I said, there was another book that came out, with the same type of title, and neither book there was no poet and both of them were like anthologies of different poets in America that were important, and they covered completely different poets. There was not a poet that was used in both books. And I definitely moved from the Saturday Review type poetry to the beat type poetry and writing. Yeah. So he's living with Don Allen there. Now there's something that Suzuki says here. He says, it's one of the quotes with the little bell in front and behind that I chose to include in the book. If you want to practice zazen, it is necessary to have good friends. Then naturally you will have good practice. When I read that this time, I thought, wow, that could be subject to misinterpretation. You know what he means by good friends? He means Sangha. He doesn't mean just like people you're close with, you hang out with and drink with or whatever. He means good Buddhist practicing friends. And that's what he would call himself. He would say, I'm your friend, I'm your Buddhist friend or whatever. I added something else where it says, this woman Alice, that was had latched on to Suzuki and was doing everything for him, and did some very helpful things, like took up the collection and got him some false teeth. I mean, he was a sugar freak. All his life, he destroyed his teeth, he really had a sweet tooth, and it's not good for you to do that, But anyway, pardon me. It said that she bought him some long johns, and that I added he'd never seen long underwear. I added that because in the Japanese translators, you had several of them going over it, and a woman, Kaoru, was sort of like coordinating them. And she said, we have no idea what long johns are, and we can't find it. Well, I wrote her back and said, I wrote Long John on the URL line, Long John's on the URL line of my browser, and came up with many links. And here's one of them. They are long underwear. And here's a picture of it. And here's one of the links, So since they didn't know what long johns were, really, I don't know how. I thought I should add he'd never seen long underwear, because there's a lot of people. I just got a very nice Facebook message from a gentleman in Florence who had just read Crooked Cucumber and had very nice things to say, and he apologized for his English, which was perfect. But he was Italian, he was reading it in English, so he wouldn't necessarily know what long johns meant. You got to watch out about using slang in something that might be for a wider audience that would include a lot of people that English is their second language, or that, a lot of people read English but don't speak it, especially in Japan. It was very true in Japan. There are people in Japan who I see reading English newspapers, they couldn't speak at all, because that's the way their education, what it emphasized. Well, I was there 30 years ago. I think less so now, but it was very much that way there. But come to think of it, there's probably a lot of native English speakers that don't know the term long johns. Yeah, it was a little obscure to use without clarifying, probably. It says in the chapter, George Agiwara, wonderful man, loved him. It was his father who built the Japanese tea garden, and he grew up in the home there. They lost it when they became a danger to national security and had to be put in camps. Anyway, George took them over to the Japanese tea garden, Mitsu and Otohiro, when they arrived. And it said, and it told about, they're going to the Japanese restaurant, the Japanese store, the Japanese sweet shop. There in Japantown, it says, it was almost as if they'd gone to another Japanese city. Well, you won't see that so much now, but Japantown back then was wonderful. It was so cool. It was so neat, and it was sort of funky, and there were all these wonderful little stores, and I loved it. I was very happy, I started living in Japantown in 1966, and it was great. And then, it points out that she moved in with him, and Mitsu and Shunryu had never lived together before. But they quickly got along. Personally, I think they were lovers back in Japan, which would not be abnormal. That sort of thing can happen without, people are discreet, and it's not as puritanical as America. But, every culture has their rules and ways of doing things. And thank you, and okay. I said, it seemed to me you could be, having Satanist parties and sacrificing donkeys in your home as long as you remained discreet and didn't give the neighbors any reason to, didn't make any waves. But that line where it says that Shunryu did not invite, he got her a bed, put it right next to his, it says he did not invite her to his bed for the first 6 months. And Mitsu felt that was maybe because he'd been a little traumatized by some of the women coming on to him or something like that. I think, who knows why. But I learned that because she told that to Gil Fronsdale. She didn't tell that to me. But Gil told me that, boy, and I wrote that down right away. Yeah, so everybody called her Oksan, which means Mrs. Wife. It's like saying, wife, would you come over here? Well, it means, anyway, it means Oksan. And it's a very nice thing to call the woman of a home, a married woman with, in a home like that. But it's true. It says a lot of people didn't realize it was that sort of title. And in Japan, you use that a lot. You'll call a teacher sensei, and you'll say sensei here is, you don't have to use names there so much. One thing I found out living in Japan, and I was never quite sure why, it was never a problem if I couldn't remember somebody's name, introducing them to somebody else. It just was never a problem, and that's because you don't have to use names. I can't quite remember why, but I remember that. And here, when I say here, I mean America. In the West, one thing I tell Katrinka, my mother was very good at this. Look, we come up to somebody and, on the street or in a grocery store, I've taken her shopping, and mother immediately turns to me and say, David, you remember Mrs. Joan Smith? And I go, well, of course I do. And, I've threatened Katrinka with, severe punishment if she doesn't do that anytime, because that's embarrassing. And I can blank out names, or her name, anybody. I can just go blank, and that's not, that was true when I was 20s and 30s. And I'm sure you understand that happens to a very high percentage of people. And one thing I've discovered in life is that most people, when I say most, I mean a high percentage of people think they are especially bad at remembering names. So let's say 80% of people think that. They all think they're in the bottom 20%. I really noticed that. Now, there's this quote I have in the book, from Suzuki again, with Separated by Bells. If you live together, there is not much need to speak to each other. You will understand. I think there's truth in that, and depending on the circumstances. And I think that there's ways that can be applied or be true, and there's ways that can be abused. And I would say that he abused it. That I can't read that quote. I don't even know why I used it in the book. Well, I used it, but no, it's important to use it in the book. It's how he felt and it's how he lived. However, having come to know his children, they suffered because of his lack of communication with them when they were growing up, and had different degrees of resentment and sadness as a result of it. So I can't read that now without going, groaning, without groaning. But that was his tendency, and it's certainly supported by Japanese culture. However, I have talked to Hoitsu about this, and I've said, and I've mentioned this in a prior podcast, but that, he was from an earlier generation and blah, blah, blah. And Hoitsu went, no, he was worse than anybody's father. There was nobody's father like him. My friends' fathers weren't like that. Okay, it's sad, huh? But look, that's why they say it's good to live 2 valleys away from your guru. It's an old Indian saying. Um, and, putting teachers up on a pedestal and thinking they're superhuman or this or that, that's, that's for legends. That's for the Lotus Sutra. That's for myth. Uh, you know, uh, that's the way Buddha is. Buddha's perfect. I mean, there's nothing come down to us about Buddha that was bad. He was asked, "Hey, if you're so perfect, how come your students are fighting among each other sometimes?" And he said, "Because I hit a fish on the head in a prior life." That was told to me by Bob Halpern. Listen, a lot of what I know about Buddhism, I'm not a very good reader, and I'm sort of satisfied with, I don't know, what's in front of me. It's called being a bad student, being lazy. But I picked up a lot by knowing people who are voracious readers, knowing a lot of them, and I've read everything possible about Buddhism. Oh, here's I found a real mistake. Now, there's a number of little things I will change in my upcoming second edition of Crooked Cucumber. I'm gonna try to get hold of the publisher. Really, it's not easy. They don't want to relate to me, and my agent, who's a very close friend, he's retired, and it's sort of up to me to get hold of them, and they don't want to relate to me. They probably won't even answer me if I do, but I can get through to them. I was talking to him about it. He wasn't even sure who to contact now because everybody, all these publishers are buying and amalgamating, and he thought I should maybe get hold of Crown. I mean, Crooked Cucumber is Broadway Books, which was initially part of Bantam Doubleday Dell, I think, which was part of Random House, or which became part of Random House after that. And then Bertelsmann in Germany bought Random House, and now it's like Penguin, Random House, Crown. I mean, this is not good. But anyway, the whole book business and publishing is just... it's just not like what it used to be. It's good for me because, I put out print-on-demand stuff, and I put 10 zillion pages of stuff on the internet, and didn't have that back then. So that's the stuff that's destroyed publishing, or not destroyed it totally. It's still happening. I have a book coming out next year. The sequel to Zen is right here. If the world is still here, if civilization hadn't collapsed yet. So anyway, I found a mistake. I have a lot of little changes I'm making for clarification, like putting long underwear after long johns to clarify that. But I found a real mistake. I love doing that. It said when Oksan was had a little trouble with the dirty feet of Suzuki students, and he told her, "Don't complain, they're good Zen students." I mean, he sure changed in America. He liked hippies. He was just really impressed, and he was impressed with the way so many people who came in, as hippies or beatniks or idealistic artisans, and that would take to practice and not be held back by who they were when they came in. But he didn't demand people, give up everything either at all. So, but dirty feet and cool. So she was putting, and I'm surprised he didn't do this before, she put damp towels, and we do this at Zen Center now, depending on the place. Tassajara for sure, because Tassajara is dust city. She put damp towels in front of the entrance to this indo, and it says she would show the students how to wipe their feet before they stepped on the tatami. No, they did not step on the tatami. The only tatami in the room they were stepping into were the tatami that were lining the walls that people would sit on. They just stepped into a wood floor. So that escaped the eyes of many people who knew better. Until now. And now we'll have a new improved crooked cucumber at some point. If, maybe. We'll see. I think it's a great idea. I should get hold of him right now and tell him, hey, come on, come out with it next year, 50th anniversary of his death. Might be too late for me to contact him about that, but maybe not. I don't know. But you know what? I could come out with a little print-on-demand book if they're not interested in coming out with a second edition of Crooked Cucumber because, it doesn't sell enough to warrant that. I could come out with a little print-on-demand book that had corrections, additions, and changes for Crooked Cucumber. And that had an index. And that was one of the big mistakes, this book. No index. And, I just didn't know better. And nobody told me to do it. And that was a mistake. Boy, I'll tell you one thing. Libraries aren't near as interested in a book like this if they don't have an index. And I can't tell you the number of people that have said to me, God dang, why didn't you have an index? Of course, there is an index on it now on Cuke.com. But I never need to use it because I can just write whatever word I'm looking for in the site search box for the whole site, and it'll go to whatever it was, the person or whatever. And if it's in the book, it'll go to that because the book's on Cuke.com. Don't tell Random House. All right, errata, and I've got to get that in errata. And it says... then Amitsu finds Suzuki's checks. He'd never cashed a check in a couple of years. They're giving me these checks. They didn't have checks in Japan. I changed that. I had at least, it says there was no such thing as checks in Japan. I added at least as far as Mitsu knew or whatever. I don't have right here what I put there. Oh, here it is. Not that Suzuki himself was a good fiscal manager. Soon after Mitsu arrived, the treasurer of the congregation told her that her husband hadn't been cashing his paychecks. Well, gee, they wait 2 years to tell his wife. They don't want to tell him because what? They don't want to embarrass him. I could believe that. I've run into a lot weirder things than that in Japan. But it says, first, the treasurer had to explain what checks were. There was no such thing in Japan. I paused there. Now, it's true, I've never seen a check in Japan, and Bob Halpern ran a big business over there for years. He said he never saw a check. And there would be pictures in the newspapers of, suitcases full of money, 10,000 yen bills, their highest bill, which is a lot. It was like $80 to $100, depending on the exchange rate for a bill. Suitcases full of them to give employees their bonuses for, twice a year. Bob said he never saw a check, but I bet there were checks for something. So I said, I covered my ass there. At least if there was, she'd never heard of it. Now, aren't you glad to know that? Another quote I use is, between the bells is first thought, best thought. I have a whole page for that on Cuke.com. because that is more associated with Trungpa. And I associated it with Allen Ginsberg, but Allen Ginsberg said he got it from Trungpa. Now, Trungpa was well read. I mean, that guy was cultured. Anyway, back to first thought, best thought. He did say that to Tia Strozer in a adult song with her. But I think he might have gotten it from Trungpa or Allen Ginsberg, or from reading, or look, it's something people said back then. And so I have a whole thing on it on Cuke.com. I was looking for a source for it because it seems like a sort of universal thing. And also, I think it is a suspect statement. I think you got to be careful with like these blanket formulas like that. And Suzuki certainly was. I mean, he was Mr. Not Always So, really. Because so you couldn't say to him, but Roshi, you said first thought, you said first thought, best thought. So I walked in front of the car and then I got my leg broken or whatever. You idiot. Looking back at it, the best source I could see was William Blake, who said, first thought, best thought in art. Oh, now I want to get it right. Okay, I found it. Yes, on Cuke, on the page, Shunryu, Suzuki, and the Beats. First thought, and here's what Blake said. First thought is best in art. Second, in other manners. So, Suzuki was a first thought, best thought guy. And he really believed in that, But he would not let it hamper a second thought that overrode it and said, wait a minute, the entire universe will explode if you do that. Pardon me. So Yamada was coming down. I've got to get the name of the guy who was running Zenshuji when Suzuki arrived. It wasn't Yamada. Oh, well, I probably have it in the book. But I could just remember Yamada and then Sumi after him. And it said he was the new priest there when in Zenshuji and the new abbot in America, and Suzuki had him lead this sesshin. And I went, oh, really? I thought he'd been there, and I'd forgotten, And so I Googled it. And then I see, he was abbot there at Zenshuji from 60 to 64. Then he went to Japan and became president of Komazawa University, the Soto Zen University, and then he was abbot of Eiheiji. There was a whole thing back then that priests who came to America were coming because they were disgraced. That's the sort of, people in Japan with Japanese, I've heard Japanese say that, I've heard Americans say that. The Japanese gossip was always, that Suzuki came to America out of shame for his wife having been murdered. It may have been true that a priest coming from Japan to America was doing so because there was some problem there in some cases, but mainly I'd say it was because they were interested in going abroad and seeing what it was like and teaching here. One little entry I saw in the internet about Yamada was he was also a strong supporter of the Japanese Imperial Army. That was by Brian Victoria. But I would imagine by the time he came to America, he'd had second thoughts about that. So, hey, I want to tell you something else I added. It says there, it says that they said, okay, we're going to have a little publication. What do we call it? The Zen Center newsletter. And Suzuki said, I'll name it. And he ran upstairs. They were in the downstairs office. And he said he came back soon. Did it say 20 minutes or something? He came back and had the name Windbell. Very good name. Good for him. And he had I don't know, it sort of indicates that he had the translation already for Dogen's poem, Windbell. I wonder about that. I mean, you can't zip that off in 20 minutes. But anyway, he did it. So I thought, wow, why did I say that and not include that poem in the book? It's very short. So I added it to what I read. And I will read it again right now. Windbell. Hanging in space by his mouth. His whole body is his mouth. East, west, south, and north wind. He does not care. Always he talks in many ways about prajna paramita for others. Tsu Chin Tsun Ryan, Tsu Chin Ryan, Dogen. That is so Chinese seeming, that those are the sounds of the bell. I wonder if that sounds they make. That's the sort of thing I could write Shoako Okamura and ask him that. He is so helpful. He'd answer me in a day or two. I also think we could probably do better on the translation. Right away, I would change it to, I wouldn't have he there. I would say it. Or, in Japanese, you don't need that. You don't need those words. It won't be there in the original. It won't have a he. It would. So he threw that in. And, the whole idea of not using he for, what do you call it, for gender non-specific, the idea of not doing that was not in vogue yet. Incidentally, I was very, very early, years ago, in starting to use they instead of he for when you don't know. I've always liked they, and I looked into it and talked to people that are better educated than me, and they said, yeah, that is not just a possibility in English. It's actually done in some other languages, and I've always felt comfortable with it. And I started doing that before it was a thing to do, and I never had an editor give me a problem. Of course, I haven't written a zillion things either. There's only a few times that I've had editors at publishers or at a magazine go over stuff, but I didn't have. Nobody said, oh, you can't say that, say he or she. Or, what I really don't like is alternating he and she. Oh, come on, stop it. I don't like using she instead of he. That's the sort of thing that stops you, that's causing trouble in your mind. They doesn't. Also don't like to use I a lot, and that's really hard to do sometimes. I mean, I thought, we could change he to it, but I think he chose a personal pronoun on purpose. But I still think it would work. It can be personal. I added when it says he was being installed as the abbot of Sojiji in a mountain seat. In a mountain seat ceremony, he was being installed as the abbot of Sokoji in a mountain seat ceremony. I put comma or dash Shinsan Shiki. I just wanted to put the Japanese in there. It had the word Daosho in one of his poems I included, but it didn't tell what that meant. And, a lot of people now know, but I think it should have said Daosho means great priest. It calls the semi-legendary Bodhidharma. I think since then, I've come to know Andy Ferguson and Red Pine, who've done wonderful work in China, and I think they have proved that Bodhidharma was a real person. And they proved that the second patriarch was a real person. They found his temple, and it was not known. And they did it. They saw on a map a little town called Second Patriarch City or Second Patriarch Village. And they went there and they said there was just a pile of rubble. They were shown, yes, this was his temple. Yeah, maybe I should change that. It says that the sesshin that Suzuki said every period. Oh, I'll leave it. I mean, I started thinking, well, he was giving Doksan too. And it wasn't just Yamada giving Doksan. I can just hear an editor, me saying that, and the editor saying, "They'll understand. People understand. That includes that. Don't worry about it." See, I'm going to explain too much. Good editors will say, "No, you don't have to do that. Don't junk it up with too many comments like I'm doing now." Can you imagine? If you say this is what the book would have been like if I hadn't had an editor, it just would have been going on. No, just kidding. So the first ordination took place on Sunday, September 2nd, and this is so often forgotten because the next one was in 1970, Sunday, September 2nd, 1962. And why did Suzuki not ordain anybody until 1970 again? Well, he had some discouraging experiences early on. In Japan, somebody says they're going to do something, they do it. If they get ordained, they stick. Somebody comes to a temple there and says, I want to dedicate my life to Buddhism, they'll ordain them and they'll dedicate their life to Buddhism. Or to what is required of that particular ordination. People are dependable there, and you can count them. At least you could back then. That's what he was used to. He came to America, somebody'd come to him and say, they'd be so sincere. I really, really want to get enlightened. I'll dedicate my life to Buddhism. I'll do everything. And they'll say, all right, I'll teach them how to sit and this and that. And I think, oh, good, but maybe they can be a priest and I'll ordain them and this and that. And then they'll say, all right, that was good. I enjoyed that. Now I'm going to take up golf. So anyway, Americans are not like Japanese that way. So he said he had some discouraging experiences with people he'd ordained early on, like McNeil and Hintz, who he considered it that he'd ordained them, is my feeling, even though he said, my friend ordained them for me. And you know what? I wish to heck he wouldn't have said stuff like, I wish if I'd been thinking back then, I would have raised my hand. Suzuki wrote you, when you say my friend, would you tell us the name of the bird? Well, it was the abbot of Seikyu-nen. I could find out who it was then. I remember him saying that somebody, or maybe more than one of them, had returned the Raksus to him at some point and decided they didn't want to be Buddhists, or that was enough of that for them. And so there wasn't another ordination until 1970, but I'm talking about lay ordinations here. There were priest ordinations. It was just a matter of him being more confident, having a higher standard for seeing that somebody was committed. That was really his criteria for a priest ordination, but he didn't want to do a lay ordination either for somebody who was, just sort of passing through. So I'm going to read you the names of all the people who were ordained. There were 15. And how was 15 decided on? Because there were 15 Raksus that were brought from Japan by Yamada or were there or whatever. So it's the week finished Sunday with the new Shinjiki initiation ceremony for 15 persons who have practiced Zazen at this temple for 1 year or more. I'm reading from the Wind Bell from September 10th, 1962. Each person was given a Buddhist name and a Raksu or Buddhist robe. Now, the ones I've seen are not like the ones we have. They were more like strips worn around the neck, and they didn't have the whole bib thing in the middle with the characters written on back. Those receiving the robe or this symbol of the robe, were Betty Warren, Della Gertz, Charles Gilman, Bob Carr, Bill Kwong, Richard Aspen, Paul Alexander, Constance Lewick, Philip Wilson, Jan Haley, Al Levinson, Urbane Kinst, Sally Unger, Graham Petchy, and Richard Baker. Now, the reason Jean Ross didn't get it is that she was already in Japan. And Della's name, it was really interesting. It was Zendo Taejun Daishi. That's really unusual. Usually there's 4 characters. That would be 6 characters in her name. Because they use the Chinese pronunciation in those names. So they're all single syllable. Zindote Jundaishi. Wow. A rather long name composed of characters that he said meant Zen-way faith, refined naturalness. Sweet Della. This stuff's all really interesting to me, and, it's fun to reminisce on. And, one experience I have when I go over this stuff, that I have to sort of deal with it, is I go, it's too late to ask that person this and that. Oh, and I should have done so-and-so. A lot of stuff like that. Oh, why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do that? And man, I just tell myself, shut up. What stupid stuff. You've done enough. It doesn't matter if you never do anything else. None of this had to be done to begin with. And remember the motto of Cuke Archives, or the something. Motto, that's all right. From Philip Whalen, that I frequently quote, him saying, "Oh, David, just enough survives." Yeah, but I find it sort of fun. I like trivia. I mean, really, a lot of this is just trivia. I spent, in preparing to do this, I spent an hour and a half just looking at notes, and I got lost on Eru Price, that guy who told Graham about coming to Sokoji. Although Pauline thinks it maybe it was entirely Kato that told him. But Graham remembers Eru Price. Then Pauline said, well, maybe he mentioned it and then Kato gave him the number. But I started looking at everything I could find on Eru Price because he was an interesting character. And I'm going to bring that up in comments on the next chapter. We might say that the theme of this chapter is Suzuki deciding to stay in America. Now, it starts off with Hintz and McNeil coming back. That's not encouraging. He must have been very discouraged about that. I mean, he kept going. But what a teacher wants is they want Dharma heirs. They want people to continue the teaching. If he doesn't see something happening there that will continue the teaching, it has to be both the people and an institution, or something to hold it together. It could be people without an institution if they're very, very strong, and he had confidence that he could see that they were committed and would continue something. But actually establishing the institution and seeing it just barely beginning to take root, and Graham and Richard coming and showing real commitment and a real sense of wanting to know what he knew and commit themselves the way he committed himself. That's what makes him stay. The other students, there were so many of them, were very, very good students and very devoted. But for him to stay, he'd have to see it was going to take root. And I think that's what he saw, and that's what we see in this chapter, just beginning to happen. So that's all the comments I have on chapter 12 and whatever tangents I got into. So see you next week for chapter 13, Journeys. So that wraps it up for this episode of Cuke Audio Podcast. We appreciate your keeping us company. If you'd like to help us keep going, simply go to the homepage of cuke.com, cuke.com, or Cuke Audio Podbean, and hit the donate button, which takes you to the Cuke donate page, from which it's easy to see where to send a check or how to contribute with PayPal or become a subscriber for as little as $1 a month. So until next time, this is DC with Dogette Bandita and Feline Cuchita, and soon with dear lovely Katrinka, I pray, wishing you and yours and all of us a grand awakening.